Boa noite a todos e todas. Estamos de volta para a conferência de encerramento do Congresso do Colóquio Internacional Claude Lefort, UFMG. É com muita satisfação que recebemos para essa conferência de encerramento o professor Martín Plot, da Universidade Nacional de San Martín, na Argentina. O professor Martín Plot nos oferecerá, né, essa sua conferência que terá o título The Question of Power on Delineation of New Figures in Political Horizon, uma tradução livre para o português, a questão de poder sobre a delimitação de novas figuras no horizonte político. Professor, vou só apresentar um pouco do seu currículo antes de passar a palavra.
Muito obrigado.
Então, Martín Plot, o professor Martín Plot é autor de Chaos and Cosmos, The Imaginary and Political, em Jorge Luis Borges, publicado agora em 2024. Também em 2024 publicou o livro La Matriz e Sentido, autor do livro da Aesthetico-Political, The Question of Democracy in Merleau-Ponty, Arendt and Rancière, publicado em 2014. Indivisible, publicado em 2011. La carne del social, publicado em 2008, e editor de Claude Lefort, Thinker of the Political, publicado em 2013. É professor pesquisador de teoria política no Conselho Nacional de Pesquisas Científicas e Técnicas, o CONICET, na Argentina, e na Escola Interdisciplinar de Autoestudos Sociais, EIDAES, UNSAM, também na Argentina. É igualmente pesquisador em pensamento político no programa de Estética e Política do CalArts. Professor Martín Plot, muito obrigado por ter aceito o nosso convite. É uma honra tê-lo com a gente para esta cerimônia de encerramento e a palavra está com você. Obrigado.
Muito obrigado, Eduardo. No voy a falar portuñol para no pasar vergüenza, pero quiero decir que estoy extremadamente agradecido y me siento muy honrado por la invitación que ustedes me han hecho de estar acá. Estuve siguiendo las presentaciones durante estos 2 días. Puedo decir que mi portuñol mejoró gracias a ellas. Cada vez eran más claras o cada vez mi portuñol era mejor porque yo cada vez entendía más. Y que me siento muy honrado de sentirme ahí un poco, lamento no estar ahí físicamente para poder haber participado en las conversaciones, pero hay algo en Brasil, me viene, ya sé que es solamente referido a una ciudad, pero algo acontece no mi corazón cuando me siento que estoy en Brasil, al menos virtualmente, así que quiero agradecerles eso. Sí, elegí presentar este tema sobre el que estoy haciendo investigación ahora, que tiene que ver con las figuras de poder, verdad y libertad en la teoría política contemporánea y en las democracias contemporáneas, pero podría haber hablado de este libro que mencionaste, el de Caos y Cosmos, porque es un libro, aunque es sobre Borges, es un libro lefortiano. Quiero decir que podría haberme enfocado en eso, porque es una especie de continuación de Euclid para pensar a Borges en gran medida a partir de las problemáticas y la mirada lefortiana en Euclid. Pero vamos a enfocarnos en esto. Me pido disculpas que voy a presentar el paper en inglés, porque es en inglés que estoy escribiendo esta investigación. Así que muchas gracias por la invitación nuevamente. So, what kind of power is a democratic power? And what other kinds of power can be conceived even in the context of contemporary democracies? Power, that simple word. In The Question of Democracy, Lefort eloquently wrote, "Freedom, the simple word I have just used, is usually banished from scientific language," end of quote. He was referring to a complex constellation of discourses ranging from political science to Marxism. But power, another simple word, was also key to Lefort's thought, key to his idea of the political and to his distance with those who dream of a society without power, or rather, with an absolute one, which amounts to the same thing, a society without division and without politics. In his words, quote, "Whoever dreams of an abolition of power secretly cherishes the reference to the one and the reference to the same. He imagines a society which would accord spontaneously with itself," end of quote. In 2017, my friend, teacher, and colleague, Andrew Arato, published The Adventures of Constituent Power, its title chosen as a reference to Maurice Merleau-Ponty. For Arato, in that particular, but also in his previous works, as much as for Lefort and Merleau-Ponty, power is never absolute, and a democratic understanding of power must always be self-limited and pluralistic. In this paper, I will engage in a dialogue with Lefort, Merleau-Ponty, and Arato's work on the question of power, as well as with recent developments in the political life of the Americas, both North and South, as a means of offering a contemporary examination of the relationship of power to the political institution of society in our contemporary democracies. If you can face the public, it's better, so I can see.
Yeah.
Anyway, I saw that you were struggling with that. And hi, people.
Hello.
So that was a kind of very brief introduction. What do we call power? I do not ignore that the question could have multiple answers. I do not ignore that this multiplicity could emerge from the colloquial or popular uses of the term as much as from its theoretical uses. In the former, power tends to be conceived as the vanishing point of those political discourses that perceive themselves as fighting against or suffering from some kind of domination, or, alternatively, from the imaginary perspective of those wishing to place themselves in that vanishing point, seeing themselves as sovereign masters of society as a whole. It is due to this fact that power, in its positive, concrete manifestation, might assume as large a multiplicity of figures as rejections of, grievances against, or aimed at forms of domination there are. These figures of power in political discourses, then, in their generic notion, do not refer to a concrete entity, but to a vanishing point that directs the vision towards a pole, establishing a polarity with an other that is identified as responsible for the determination of what exists, precisely of the state of affairs that is rejected, sought to be transformed, or exercised. On the side of the theoretical discourse, the uses of the notion of power divert in part, although not completely, from this general structure of political discourses. I would not be able to exhaust in this text, nor in many others, of course, the notions of power existing in theoretical discourse. So let us just content ourselves with identifying, for the purposes of this talk, 4 notions central to 20th and 20th century social and political theory, 21st century social and political theory. For Arendt, power emerges from action, more precisely from concerted action. Power might be exercised either by an individual or a collective actor, but this actor can exercise it only to the extent that she or he shows to be capable of persuading the many, thanks to their words and actions, of supporting their political positions in the space of appearances. In this way, power shares with force, authority, and violence only the fact that the many accept a state of affairs or a directionality taken by a political process, but differs from them in that this acceptance is not the result imposed by a violence to which it's neither possible nor effective to resist, an authority it does not occur as to question, or a force our own strength would not be able of counteracting. For Arendt, when the matter is one of power, we are before an acceptance that is proactive, fueled by a phenomenon of collective persuasion that goes further than the merely tacit, as when I obey an authority, or even strategic, when I choose not to oppose a violence or a force that I would not be able to bend. We will only briefly return to these Arendtian aspects later. But let us now add that power is also a notion central to 2 thinkers of a later generation, both roughly 20 years younger than her, Michel Foucault and Lefort. I will not focus much on Foucault because my work on his study is brief and took place long ago. Therefore, I would need to invest the time I do not have now if I were to integrate his contributions to my current analysis. This is something I will certainly have to do as part of my research, since this presentation today is part of a larger, as you know, as always the case, a larger project on how new figures of power, truth, and freedom delineate themselves against the background of contemporary political horizons. Having said this, let me just mention that for Foucault, power is alveolar, of the order of the tacit, but also of the order of force. That it does not require persuasion in a space of appearances, but rather an effective functioning in the form of a dispositif, embodied in subjective behavior, and that its functioning is not strictly political, but rather takes place in the dispersion of social relations. From Arendt, we will thus retain her identification of power as a phenomenon different from those of authority, force, or violence, but we will push aside the illusion that they could remain isolated from each other and that they do not intertwine, sometimes indistinguishably, in the flesh of the social. From Foucault, we will retain the alveolar character of his notion of social power, because it indeed signals in the direction of those horizons that tie the relational power dispersed through the social body, quote-unquote social body, to a pole that becomes incarnated and invisibilized, either due to its divine, superhuman origin, or to its epistemic, infrahuman one. With these notions, we therefore reach Lefort, with whom we will stay for the remaining of the talk. Power, for the French philosopher, as much as for the previously mentioned regular political discourses, power exercises both the attraction and the rejection that emanates from a pole. This pole also refers to a determination of what exists, to an exteriority to what it is in the sense of the being of the social, that nevertheless shows to be decisive on the attributes of this very being. What makes itself visible or remains hidden, what becomes capable of being achieved, or what is perceived as merely utopic, what seems to be inscribed in the logic of things, or what is almost impossible to conceive. Open as they are, these dimensions of collective perception to the multiplicity of possible orders, historical indeterminacy, orders that are the result of sedimented and reactivated conflicts and concerted action, assumes in concrete societies a determination that is also tacit, as a result of the pole of powers shaping, staging, and making sense of the social. As it can be seen, this thought seems paradoxical. We establish a relation between two notions, those of power and the social, but we nevertheless assume between them a mutual exteriority. To what is it that this exteriority refers? The key to the Lefortian comprehension of this exteriority between power and the social resides in a non-positivist ontology of society. Societies do not simply are. They are in making themselves be. Societies are reversible. They are object, quote unquote, because, you know, as you know, Indivisible and Invisible, Merleau-Ponty, every time he uses object and subject, quotes it because he's really overcoming this, that it's about his work. But let's repeat that gesture. They are object since they are a material, since they have a material consistency. They exist in a determined space and time. But they are also subject. And we should also use here the plural in singular subjects, since they are both agent and made of agents, both individual and collective. Societies may act as a unit. In their extreme form, they can even make war. But they are also themselves made of a plurality of agents that act one against and with the others in that stable equilibrium that they are, while they are making themselves be. But how can we understand this ontology? Where does it come from? Its conceptual origin, though not its interpretive origin, resides in Merleau-Ponty's philosophy of flesh. For him, flesh is an element in the sense of the pre-Socratics, a general style of being. As opposed to fire, air, earth, or water, flesh is not just passivity. That is, an element that is displaced, modified, or broken because of its collision with or influenced by another element. Flesh is also activity. Let us be clear. Flesh is, no doubt about it, passivity. That is, an element that is displaced, modified, I skipped a line. Let us be clear. Flesh is, no doubt about it, passivity, since it is there, visible, touchable. It occupies a determined space and time. But it is also, and at the same time, activity, since it sees, touches, and can attempt to either extend or end its very occupation of a determined time and space. The flesh is visible and seer, touchable and touching. It is sensible and sentient. The flesh is both subject and object. This is what makes it reversible. The question is, however, can it be subject and object at the same time? Husserl's famous example, revisited several times by Merleau-Ponty, makes the latter answer in the negative. When my right hand, I'm sorry I'm not there, so you can't see the desk, but this is the typical, everyone knows about this example. So when my right hand touches the table, it is a touching flesh. If subsequently, I, however, touch my right hand with my left hand, the right hand miraculously ceases its touching, its activity, and becomes touched, passivity, instead. This new situation, this new internal horizon, could be changed at discretion without even moving our body, as long as my body schema switches and alternates back and forth from touching the table to touching the hand and vice versa. What has this to do with power? You might exasperately ask. A lot. For Lefort and for Merleau-Ponty in his unfinished work, the flesh as element or general style of being does not limit itself to human, animal, or even vegetable bodies. The flesh is also the general wing of being of the intercorporeal and of collective beings and behaviors. Like the schools of fish that, while feeling attacked by dolphins, plastically change their configuration. Like the flocks of birds harmoniously adapting to the crosswinds. Societies and human collectives are also passivity and activity, also sensible to themselves and to others in all their parts, and capable of responding to that sensibility as agents willing or not to modify the course of events or to give themselves new configurations. The flesh's general style of being is chiasmatic. It is a two-in-one. I have two eyes but one vision, two hands but one touch. It has an outside of its inside and an inside of its outside. The flesh is a two-dimensional being, says Merleau-Ponty. The flesh is agent and patient, acting and acted upon. It sees and acts on itself, on others, and on the world, but it is nevertheless incapable, as in the example of the hands, of closing the circle of its reversibility in a fusion without division. It persists a two-in-one as long as it continues to be flesh. If I'm not wrong, I might be. These final reflections might have helped us become aware of what it is that we are theoretically reconstructing. This chiasmatic being of flesh is what Lefort called the political, the interior-exterior institution of the social. And what he called power is what in any existing social flesh becomes the self outside that shapes, stages, and makes sense of the self inside. This political ontology, it is true, might seem extremely abstract, but it also surprisingly reveals in its interpretive activation, quite pragmatic and concrete dimensions. We were saying a few lines ago that we were going to synthetically outline what rests in the conceptual origin of Lefort's ontology of the reversibility of the political. But we also suggested, in passing, that this conceptual origin did not exhaust the genesis of this political ontology. Lefort's perspective is co-originated, together with his philosophical dialogue with Merleau-Ponty, and of course, also Machiavelli and even Marx, in his interpretation of the main historical mutations that took place at the heart of modern and contemporary European societies. In the first place, Lefort identified such mutation that led from the ancien theologico-political regime to modern democracy. Secondly, he identified such mutation that led from modern democracy to the 20th century totalitarianisms, this time as a result of the longing for the restitution of the markers of certainty lost in the democratic revolution at the time of the social crisis generated by the Industrial Revolution and the world wars. We will not slow down here on the details of his analysis. I want to simply notice the figures of power revealed in these three different historical formations. In the Ancien Regime, power was seen as radically exterior to the social, a result of the perpetuation in the European monarchies of the two bodies of Christ, the celestial and the carnal. Power was still, or already, this chasm or fold of the social, that exterior of the interior we just described. But it was conceived symbolically as giving shape, staging, and making sense of the social from a radical beyond, heteronomously experienced as a result of a divine will. This power was incarnated in the figure of the monarch Christ, that with his corporeal duplicity gave body to society as a whole. Nevertheless, this representation of the chiasm of the political was radically transformed by the democratic revolutions, even though, as Tocqueville had previously suggested, the generative principle of equality had already been eroding for centuries the old regime's fixed and embodied hierarchies, an erosion of which Lefort's Machiavelli in the Making also gives testimony, identifying in the Italian writer the new emergence of a thinking of the political as the power that institutes the social. This long-term transformation, then, one that sped up during the revolutionary period, manifested itself in the beheading of the kings, and with them of the body politics at large. Power, once incarnated, now became an empty place. This formula, however, does not indicate a non-existing power. It signals in the direction of a non-incorporated power, challengeable in its legitimacy every time it is exercised. This institutionalized questioning gave itself, and will continue to give itself, multiple institutional arrangements. But what it will not be able to do, if it is to continue being democratic, is to reincarnate itself in the figure of a concrete body, either individual or collective. Finally, this opening of the social to the chiasm of the political, that is always at the mercy of radical delegitimation, led, under certain circumstances of crisis or enemy, to the longing for a reincarnation of power. This is what Lefort called totalitarianism. And the new concept was, at the time, necessary, because this social formation implied the delineation of a different horizon and the emergence of a new figure of power. Totalitarianism is a concept that, I quote Lefort, designates a regime in which the source of power becomes unlocalizable. That source supposedly resides neither in someone, a monarch, despot, or tyrant, or a group of people, aristocrats or oligarchs, nor, properly speaking, in the people altogether. Totalitarian is thus the right word to explain the advent of a mode of domination in which many kinds of signs were effaced at one and the same time. The signs of division between the dominating and the dominated, of distinctions among power, law, and knowledge, and of a differentiation among the spheres of human activity, end of quote. Deactivated the theologico-political effectiveness of incarnating in a double body a pole of power capable of shaping society as the exterior of society's interior, the longing for certitude in times of rationalism and ideologization of truth acquire a new form, in my words, not those of Lefort, now epistemic rather than theological. Lefort said, I quote, "Democracy was born from the rejection of monarchical domination, from the collectively shared discovery that power does not belong to anyone, that those who exercise it do not incarnate it, that they are only temporary trustees of public authority, that the law of God or nature is not vested in them, that they do not hold the final knowledge, this is key, of the world and social orders, and that they are not capable of deciding what everyone has the right to do, think, say, and understand," end of quote. But in totalitarianism, this time it is from the interior of the social, not from the celestial beyond, that a source of legitimacy emerges, embodied in a social or individual actor that claims for itself a sort of closure of the chiasm of the political. I don't have the time here to unpack this idea, but in The Visible and Invisible, talking about touch and vision as total parts, Merleau-Ponty outlines indeed a model for the understanding of Lefort's notion of power and his critique of the totalitarian impossible swallowing up of the head in the body, in which the whole is no longer dissociated from the attraction of the parts, end of quote. In short, in totalitarianism, a total part of the chasm of the political aims at becoming an impossible totality instead. This model, that is sometimes the Lefortian model, that is sometimes read in a rigid way, is what in other texts of mine I have suggested should be read instead as a dynamic game of horizons that has become characteristic of contemporary politics. In this context, let me now invite to my analysis Arato's ideas of self-limitation and post-sovereign constituent power, a democratic, chiasmatic, and reversible power not capable of collapsing the constituent and the constituted in a complete totality. Interpreting out of experience, like Lefort and Merleau-Ponty, Arato developed his theory of post-sovereign multi-stage constitution making, mostly inspired by the roundtables from Central and Eastern Europe's transitions to democracy. The previous regimes in the region had mostly paper constitutions, in practice ignored by the ruling party. At the time of the transitions, however, those paper constitutions were reactivated, fundamentally for the purpose of using the reform clauses for the creation of transition constitutions that would put in place negotiated rules and procedures, accepted by all parties, to draft the new definitive constitution for the new regimes. In the manner of Merleau-Ponty and Lefort, what Arato theorized out of this experience was the process of institution of new regimes in avoidance of a legal vacuum, a vacuum that would dangerously create the conditions for one of the parties to the process to find itself in the position of claiming a full embodiment of popular sovereignty, thus creating a disguised organ sovereignty with its elective affinity for dictatorship. In much of his work since, Arato has focused on the popular element of this disguised organ sovereignty, accurately choosing the theologico-political model as a way of describing its form of embodiment. As I also do with Lefort, however, I want to propose an extension of Arato's model that would allow us to think of epistemic political forms of re-embodiment as well. Arato sees the secularized theologico-political idea of the people as the main alternative to the empty place of power during post-revolutionary modernity. While Lefort saw totalitarianism as an also secularized but epistemic political alternative to the lack of an available theological source of legitimacy. I believe that Arato's critique of this idea of sovereign constituent power and his theory of post-sovereign, self-limited constitution making or democratic power should be expanded to involve the epistemic as much as the theological, populist political horizon. In the words of Arato, quote, Smith's constitutional theory contains the most developed version of the myth that an entity that cannot be sociologically or procedurally identified, nevertheless, is a legitimate source of both power and authority. The body that exercises the actual role, rather than a fictional body that serves as its principle of legitimation, remains the one that embodies the sovereign power of the state, end of quote. This definition allows us to put forward the idea that organ sovereignty could be either based on a mythical, theological secularized people, or it could alternatively be based on an also mythical but theological secularized knowledge of intrinsic social laws that claims to be absolute and therefore sovereign in its exercise of power over the determination of society. That is, what I am saying, using Arato's words, is that neither the people nor that knowledge could be sociologically or procedurally identified and are thus in need of an embodied form of organ sovereignty in their claim to an absolute exercise of power. It is thus both the theological, populist, and the epistemic horizons that challenge the democratic, post-sovereign, empty place of power in their claim to an absolute and therefore sovereign source of legitimacy. In a lecture delivered in 2000, and precisely titled Le Pouvoir, Lefort concluded with the following words. I quote him, "In the present, it is the planetary expansion of the market that claims to be self-regulated that defies democratic power," end of quote. Bringing together Arato and Lefort's critique of sovereign embodied notions of power, I would thus like to suggest that both epistemic sovereignty, as much as popular sovereignty, should both be considered possible alternative forms of theological secularized, reincorporated power that defy democratic power. Let me give a concrete reference to what I have in mind. Trump, Bolsonaro, and Milei, it is of them that I am thinking when I wonder how is it that three empirically so different political leaders and movements, two of them putting forward a neo-populist, radically restrictive, Christian and ethno-nationalist idea of the American or Brazilian peoples, the other, one invoking an anarch-capitalist and teleological neo-totalitarian truth, one that authorizes him to exercise power as a Schmittian sovereign dictator in the context of a self-declared exception. Trump, Bolsonaro, and Milei, how is it that they see themselves and others see them as fellow travelers in their insurgent assault on the current democratic regimes? What they share, I think, is a notion of sovereign power and of organ sovereignty, one that emerges from a new amalgam of theological and epistemic horizons. The theologico-political horizon, the one before which a figure of power radically exterior to society gets delineated as imbued in a providential legitimacy, did not disappear from the political imagination of modern and contemporary societies because of the effective collapse of the theologico-political monarchies. This horizon often stopped being hegemonic, but it persists as an available, though not dominant, individual and collective actors' means of organizing the expectations, hopes, and even the fight for and exercise of power. The epistemic political horizon, the one before which a figure of power interior to society is delineated, but one which equally claims its capacity to represent the whole of the social due to a knowledge of its fundamental intrinsic laws, has not disappeared with the defeat of Nazism or the collapse of the communist regimes. This horizon has often stopped being hegemonic in Europe and the Americas, the regions have any knowledge about at all, but it persists as an available, though not dominant, individual or collective actors' means of organizing their expectations, hopes, and even their fight for an exercise of power. I will simply state that both horizons, in Argentina as much as in the United States and probably Brazil, even if they are diametrically opposed to each other in a structural sense, identifying a pole of power that is neither radically transcendent or radically immanent to the social, have often seen themselves united in their rejection of the notion of democratic power as a disembodied power, contingently exercised from an external interior pole that remains ontologically empty. The theological and epistemic horizons organize the determination of the social from a pole of power that assumes a sovereign and not self-limited position of certainty. And these certainties, antinomic to each other as they are in their self-perception, converge nonetheless in their repulsion for democratic indeterminacy. Now I start the final part, the last third of the paper, and I will move to some more interpretive theorizing. I believe this conceptual matrix could be of value for the understanding of the new figure of sovereign power that delineates itself in the horizon of my troubled Argentina, but also of my other troubled country, the United States of America. I will not talk of Brazil here, of course, something I would leave my audience to do, and which, of course, would be very interested in hearing about. To show this relevance, the relevance of this model, we would have to first look back and recognize that until the so-called transition to democracy in Argentina, or even the civil rights movement in the US, but I will stick to Argentina first, the pole of power represented itself as a semi-incarnated power. Political division instituted the unity of society, as Lefort suggested in his reading of Machiavelli and beyond. But this division used to restitute the dream of a unity without division every time the Christian and Western motherland, la patria occidental y cristiana, I'm sure you have similar expressions around, expressed in the guns and soul of the nation, the armed forces, decided to put an end to that conflict. Time thereafter, the cycle would continue and political and social conflict would reemerge, of course, but it was also the complete circle that would get restarted once again. And this regime lasted from 1930 to 1983 in Argentina. The Proceso de Reorganización Nacional, the last military dictatorship in Argentina, sought to give a massive closure to the hybrid character of this semi-incarnated regime, making it fully a re-embodied sovereign in the Schmittian but also Aratus sense. Argentine civil society, however, with some international support and in alliance with very few lucid political leaders, ended up forcing the transition to and consolidation of democracy, reverting the meaning of the period, making it instead that of one that democratically emptied the place of power. Since the events of 1983-87, I could explain this periodization later if you want, Argentina became a democracy in the Lefortian sense, and power remained since disincorporated, only temporarily occupied by those who periodically and contingently emerged victorious from the political and electoral struggle. Moreover, and again in agreement with Lefort's views, Argentine democracy, recognizing the idea of rights, its generative principle. To put it in the words of Arato and Jean Cohen, rights are necessarily paradoxical. Formally, they represent a voluntary self-limitation of state power, end of quote. And in the words of the French thinker, rights are a generative principle of the democratic form of society because they establish an unbreachable gap between power and the social. They institute and preserve its political chiasm. They avoid the fusion of society as seen, as society as seer, of society as an instituted social and society as an instituting power. And the defense of human and civil rights, and the promotion of social rights became the new regime's pillars. It is in relationship to these two pillars that the figure of a self-limited power emerged. As Arato and Cohen stated, logically, at least, state action can aim at its own self-limitation. This indeed happened in Argentine new democracy. Delineated against the democratic horizon of power as an empty place and the contingency characteristic of political authorities, the state's legitimate use of violence became self-limited, particularly if we compare it to Argentine past or even to the present uses in societies near and far. Inversely, social and civil rights continue to be generated out of the egalitarian principle. Secular divorce, egalitarian marriage, universal social security rights, hospitalitarian immigration laws, abortion. So I repeat, social and civil rights continue to be generated out of the egalitarian principle, and political authorities were often their promoters. In short, limited power in its use of violence, proactive power in the expansion of equality. This was the figure of power that revealed itself against the democratic horizon of an empty place in Argentina since 1983. Now it's the end of the good part, so let's take a break. This is not the place to try to explain the economic, social, cultural, and political reasons for what has happened. But we can simply assert that these two notions of rights, with their correspondent idea of self-limited power and a proactive state, have, in many respects, failed to deliver and are now in deep crisis in Argentina. It is because of this crisis that an alternative horizon has began to organize the relationship between the visible and the invisible, and the thinkable and the unthinkable in the South American country. Aratu Cohen wrote, at the time of the peak of neoliberalism, a few key lines that radicalized could be written word by word in Argentina today. I quote them. The crisis of the welfare state in Argentina, in the specific form of the democratic regime born in 1983, presents us with difficult political choices. Although we agree with some aspects of neoconservative and neoliberal economic diagnosis, we cannot accept the strategy of privatization and deregulation or the neoconservative emphasis on tradition and authority. Systematically speaking, these recipes call for the re-economization of society and the destruction through monetary relations and at times through political repression of many of the institutions and cultural potentials of a modern civil society. End of quote. And of a democratic understanding of power as well, I will add. If we remember Lefort's words quoted above, totalitarianism effaces, quote, the distinctions among power, law, and knowledge, and the differentiation among the spheres of human activity, end of quote. In Argentina today, the political horizon being delineated by Milei implies a de-differentiation of all human activities and a re-economization of society, reducing its plural dynamics to the imperially dominant monetary relationships of a society without civil society and without a democratic understanding of power. Everyday political discourse and analysis has in part responded to this difficult political situation with outrage, humor sometimes, very bad humor, and or nervousness. Scandalized, I would say, and similarities with the Trump case should not surprise us. Thanks, I have 5 minutes. Seeking more the confirmation of prejudice and the old normality than, I will finish in 5 minutes. Seeking more the confirmation of prejudice and from the old normality than the comprehension of the radical novelty of the emerging phenomenon. Despite this difficulty, that is, of course, reasonable, since those of us who reject the change of horizons would rather reaffirm the already known than adjust our vision to the new, something we oppose because it delineates figures unacceptable for us. Despite this difficulty, I was saying, the signs of the figures this horizon reveals are unmistakable. In the first place, instead of a proactive state in its promotion of equalities, of gender, of access to retirement, of access to education, and of healthcare, we see the emergence of a dismantled and deactivated one. A deconstructed one, Steve Bannon would say, the more radically and quickly, the better. The creation of a secretary position in the executive branch in Argentina, specifically focused on deregulation and radical reduction of the state size, anticipating what now Trump wants to do with masks, reminds us of the Revolutionary Committee of Public Health. Second, instead of a self-limited power in its use of violence, we see emerging one of internal national security, potentially unlimited in its goal of putting down civil society's demonstrations of opposition or alternative visions of the future. How is it possible that as a transformation of this scale, potentially a symbolic mutation, we could say with Lefort, since it introduces a radical change in the figure of power, how is it possible that this is taking place in a country that only last year was proudly celebrating the democratic regime for fourth decade? Fundamentally, due to the emergence of a theological epistemic notion of power that rejects the contingency of political struggle and sees itself as independent, above, but mostly, definitely autonomized from that struggle, because it has arrived to put an end with the tools provided by an definitive knowledge of the social to the political and social divisions that have dominated Argentina during the past decades, and of course have dominated and indeed enter in a permanent state of crisis, as probably you know. For this new, both epistemic and theological horizon, what Argentine society requires emerges from a knowledge of the social, not from the contingency of its democracy. Milei does not claim to embody power in the name of the people. He does it in the set definitive knowledge of the laws that rule, or ought to rule, Argentine and every society. For Milei, an anarch-capitalist who wants to destroy the state in the name of a definitive knowledge of society, his motto is definitely not that of l'État c'est moi, I am the state, which, according to Trotsky, as famously quoted by Lefort, is almost a liberal formula. With Lefort, we could say that, but now in the context of a democratic regime that still puts limits to his ambitions, Milei's formula is that of la société c'est moi, I am society, instead. In Argentina, Milei's new horizon is radically ideological, epistemic, and seeks to become hegemonic, but it of course still remains to be seen what the future may hold for us. In democracy, Merleau-Ponty said in Adventures of the Dialectic, there are only advances, and one does not kill for relative progress. When the promised progress is absolute, however, only the forces of heaven, I don't know if you have heard, las fuerzas del cielo, this is its meaningfully theological component of Milei, only the forces of heaven will tell how far this epistemic power will go in a use of force that now claims to not recognize rights, that is, that does not recognize any democratic, pluralistic, unbreachable distance between power and society. I quote, "The assurance of being the carrier of truth is vertiginous," as Merleau-Ponty put it in Adventures of the Dialectic. It is in itself violence, he concluded. I have one paragraph of 10 lines, if I have the time, because it's on the US. It's a reference to the US. If I'm allowed to do it, I go ahead. Let me conclude now by further inquiring into our times, adding to the picture and commenting on a very brief quotation on what I earlier referred to as my other country, the United States, of which I would be very much open to talking about later if there is any interest among the audience. Trying to offer a partially and certainly not explicitly Lefortian explanation to why a significant number of American workers ended up voting for Trump in the recent American elections, I quote, Randy Weingarten, president of the American Federation of Teachers, said voters who felt they had control over their lives through higher education or union representation had sided with Democrats. But, she said, people who felt like there's too much change in the pace of technology, in the cost of living, in the fear of a country being different than they thought it was, they wanted a strong man to fix it. And that man was Mr. Trump, end of quote. And as the latter, Trump himself, put it in closing his speech at the Madison Square Garden and offering the certainty his voters demand, in particular in relationship to the soon-to-be purged parasite immigrants, the targeted enemy within for him, I quote, "We will not be invaded. We will not be occupied. We will not be overrun. We will not be conquered. We will be a free and proud nation once again, end of quote. It is this desire for a restored sense of certainty embodied in a sovereignist, with both theological and epistemic components, notion of power that today haunts our contemporary democracies. In my opinion, the preservation or reinvention of democratic power will demand much more than sanitary coalitions to confront these new theological epistemic leaders and movements. It will demand the appearance of novel forms of political imagination and creativity, capable of making democratic power once again compatible with renewed and shared senses of freedom, security, and solidarity for our times. Thanks for the patience. Thanks so much.
Teríamos alguma pergunta de imediato? Não? Professor Martín Plot, muito obrigado pela sua apresentação, uma fala muito instigante e que nos faz, né, pensar a política que está acontecendo hoje, né, e de certa forma nos traz, né, para juntamente com Lefort, com Merleau-Ponty, com um conjunto desses pensadores tão potentes para a gente continuar refletindo, né? É uma reflexão sempre inacabada sobre quais são os horizontes, né, do poder democrático, não é? Ou de né, de uma instituição democrática do social, né? Uma coisa que eu gostaria de abordar desde o começo, algo que eu comecei a pensar, na verdade, já com a apresentação, acredito que seja a sua colega Cláudia Hilb, quando a professora Cláudia Hilb falou sobre a questão da servidão voluntária, que é a partir do momento em que há essa ruptura com o esquema teológico-político, com a Revolução Democrática, claro, na perspectiva, estamos aqui falando da perspectiva, a interpretação do Lefort, seria essa Revolução Democrática, se ao mesmo tempo a questão da desincorporação do poder, também poderíamos tratá-la como uma secularização do poder, se essa secularização e se essa Revolução Democrática, pelo fato de ainda remetermos para algumas figuras de poder que também remetem digamos, para esse momento que supostamente teríamos ultrapassados, poderíamos falar de uma secularização inacabada do poder, que não está completamente feito. Não sabemos se realmente algum dia essa secularização vai se dar de forma completa mas que ao mesmo tempo que estamos lidando com uma época histórica onde existe essa desincorporação do poder, existe esse lugar vazio do poder, então temos um conflito constante de tentativas de ou impedir essa secularização do poder, dela realmente terminar, ou nos falta, né, pensar novas figuras como o professor tentou fazer na sua fala, novas figuras de poder que estejam mais conectadas com esse tempo histórico que vivemos a partir da Revolução Democrática. Não sei se conseguiu me entender, a pergunta não está muito clara na minha cabeça, tentei mais uma impressão do momento, mas para, enfim, estabelecermos aqui um diálogo com a sua conferência. Obrigado.
Muchas gracias, Eduardo, por la pregunta. Dos dimensiones pienso están asociadas a tu comentario. La primera es la cuestión de la secularización como sinónimo de democratización. Yo no usaría secularización como sinónimo de democratización. Al contrario, tomaría en serio la noción schmittiana de que todos los conceptos modernos de Estado, las nociones modernas de Estado, son conceptos teológicos secularizados, y tomaría efectivamente en serio la idea de que el totalitarismo es, como nos dice Lefort, la forma en la que las sociedades modernas, carentes de la opción simbólica teológico-política, abrazan esta especie de inmanencia radical de los movimientos totalitarios como forma de restituir las certidumbres perdidas, ¿no? En ambos casos, yo diría, de una manera schmittiana o lefortiana, que la secularización de una noción de poder no necesariamente significa la democratización de la noción de poder, porque efectivamente puede estar reencarnada, ya sea en su versión populista, que es una idea de pueblo que en algunas circunstancias, no obviamente en la mirada cíclica de un pueblo que renueva su identidad en Lefort, sino en la mirada más encarnada que algunos líderes populistas efectivamente ponen en escena, ¿no? Como una vez adquirida una representación popular, la sostienen como eternamente válida, encarnan esa representación. O también la de movimientos ideológicos. Yo creo que el neoliberalismo de forma más moderada y figuras borderline patéticas como Milei, pero quién sabe qué nos depara el futuro, de forma más radical, son encarnaciones epistémico-políticas de ese poder secularizado. En ambos casos, la idea absoluta del poder permanece. Pero la secularización no garantiza democratización. Pero efectivamente eso no quiere decir que no haya permanentemente y que Lefort no esté de acuerdo, no haya acertado en identificar el fenómeno, la consecuencia de las revoluciones democráticas y de la erosión de los generada por el principio generativo de la igualdad en su lectura de Tocqueville, no hayan generado las condiciones y muchas veces la existencia de formas de sociedad democrática tales como las que él describió. Por eso, pocas veces nos animamos, me parece a mí, ustedes me dirán si estoy equivocado, pero tanto en Brasil como en Argentina, pocas veces nos animamos a incursionar en el pensar en nuestras propias sociedades en estos términos acerca no me acuerdo cuál de los expositores recibió la pregunta por la dictadura, ¿no? Por la dictadura de Brasil, nacida en 1964. Esas preguntas acá tampoco se formulan, pero si uno está hablando de Lefort, personas que están interesadas pero que no le encuentran la vuelta para pensar las sociedades contemporáneas o las sociedades latinoamericanas, al aparataje teórico de Lefort, preguntan por Argentina. Efectivamente, Argentina tuvo en el último proceso, como Chile y quizás Uruguay también, versiones que algunos cientistas políticos tradicionales han llamado cuasi totalitarias, ¿no? Y que yo creo que podríamos avanzar en esa dirección. Pero el periodo al que yo me referí en mi presentación, de 1930 a 1983, es un periodo de semi-encarnación del poder, en donde no era un periodo, o sea, ustedes habrán leído Political Science, Ciencia Política, habla de todo ese periodo en Argentina como inestable. Yo creo que eso es una pereza intelectual. Más que una inestabilidad, lo que hubo es un régimen en el cual la división social, que fundamentalmente estaba estructurada alrededor de dos nociones distintas de democracia, una democracia menos republicana y más populista como la del peronismo, y una de una democracia más liberal y republicana que populista como el radicalismo, estaba constantemente resuelta, definida por un poder de última instancia, una última ratio que eran las Fuerzas Armadas, que no eran solamente el poder militar, sino que además encarnaban esta idea de nación occidental y cristiana, etc. Entonces, me parece que esto apunta, más que una respuesta a tu pregunta, a una continuación del movimiento de tu pregunta hacia... y la segunda dimensión que yo quiero abrazar tiene que ver con lo que yo creo es la tarea, lo utilizo mucho en este libro sobre Borges, la tarea del pensamiento político para Lefort y para Merleau-Ponty, incluso famosamente expresado en las primeras líneas de las aventuras de dialéctica, ¿no? Donde dice que es un acto de arrogancia esperar tener completamente desarrollado un marco filosófico para responder filosóficamente, para hablar filosóficamente de política, ¿no? Es al revés, ¿no? La filosofía emerge de los acontecimientos, es lo visible, lo invisible de lo visible, y me parece a mí que los tiempos que corren nos están obligando a hacer esto de una manera muy explícita, es decir, nuevas figuras emergen en el horizonte de lo concebible. Yo no sé qué va a pasar. Todos dependemos de Brasil a partir de ahora, dentro de 2 años, porque yo no sé qué pasaría si en 2 años no solo Trump y Milei, sino creo que es el axis of evil, como se dijo en alguna época. Disculpen el comentario directamente político, pero efectivamente yo creo que estamos ante una potencial mutación simbólica, una potencial cambio de gestalt. Milei en este momento tiene un gran desafío, es decir, la gestalt argentina nacida en el 83 puede terminar digiriéndolo o rechazándolo, pero lo que él quiere es transformarla. Una radical nueva gestalt de lo que es Argentina, rechazando los 100 años, no solo de los años de democracia plena del 83 en adelante, sino los años en que la idea democrática empezó a incidir en la sociedad argentina desde el comienzo del siglo XX. Él rechaza explícitamente ese periodo. Entonces, es a eso a lo que apunta mi interrogación, a tratar de forzar nuestra visión, como Merleau-Ponty llamaba en Percepción, nuestra visión de je ne sais quoi, ¿no? Es nuestra visión de je ne sais quoi, no sé si los que recuerdan la fenomenología de percepción, él insiste en que cuando uno percibe, no solo percibe cosas, a veces percibe algo. Es una hermosa imagen en la playa, caminando con un amigo, y dice, yo veo algo en el horizonte de la playa. ¿Qué es? ¿Un barco hundido? ¿Un muelle? ¿Una gran roca? No, bueno, no sé qué es. Bueno, yo miro, no sé qué es, tengo una visión, y es una visión de je ne sais quoi. Bueno, yo en este momento tengo una visión de je ne sais quoi que creo que tenemos que agudizar.
Muito obrigado. Mais alguma questão? Não? Professor, por causa do horário, vamos ter que encerrar esta sessão, a última sessão do Colóquio Internacional Claude Lefort, o FMG, em prestígio ao centenário do filósofo. Eu queria lhe agradecer muito a disponibilidade, a sua conferência, e sempre que vier ao Brasil, estaremos de portas abertas para recebê-lo no FMG. Muito obrigado por ter participado do nosso colóquio. Foi uma honra tê-lo ouvido.
Bueno, muchas gracias a ustedes. Fue realmente un honor participar y asistir virtualmente a casi todas las presentaciones. Muchas gracias y ojalá nos veamos en persona en algún momento.
Sí, obrigado.
Chao, chao. Bueno, chao.
Tchauzinho, gente.